Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another video lecture. In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention to this idea of representativeness. Specifically, we're talking about the representativeness of the sample, right? So when we're considering the different instances that we've observed, we want to consider different aspects of the sample, of the individuals in the sample, in order to make sure that it's not biased in any regard. So, when we're thinking about representativeness and whether or not the sample is in some sense biased, what we need to do is think about to what extent the relevant sample is like the target group, right? It needs to be like the target group in the following ways, the following two ways. First, it needs to have all of the same relevant characteristics. Right. The not that it has to have every single thing in common, but the relevant aspects need to be in common. And then second, we need to think about whether they have the same proportion. To what extent does the sample have the same proportion of the relevant characteristics that the target group has? So those are two key things that we'll need to consider as we're thinking about to what extent the sample might be biased in one way or another. And then the other thing I want you to pay attention to is this idea of selective attention. Selective attention is when we have the tendency to focus on some very specific things, right? It's a focus intensely on those aspects and to observe or to remember those things while ignoring or suppressing other things. So again, we can consider some of the examples from the textbook to think about this idea of representativeness as it relates to whether or not the sample is biased. So here's a few examples. College students are glad that Congress is controlled by Republicans. Surveys of the members of young Republican clubs on dozen of college campuses proves this is the case. To what extent here does the relevant sample have the same relevant characteristics as the target group? And to what extent do they have them in the same proportionality? Another example says most nurses in this hospital are burned out, stressed out, and overworked. Just ask the ones who work in the emergency department. They'll tell you they're absolutely miserable. Right. So, to what extent are the nurses working in the emergency department? Are they relevantly similar to other nurses and working in other departments? Finally, a third example says, no one is happy. Almost everyone is complaining about something. Just look at all the letters to the editors in any big city newspaper. Complaints, complaints, complaints. So again, to what extent do the sample here, all of the different letters written to an editor in some big city newspaper, to what extent do these individuals have the same relevant characteristics as other people, right? Because it says nobody's happy, right? And so it looks like that's going to be biased in some important regard. So what Vaughan tells us then is that in order to be truly representative, the sample must be like the target group by one, having all of the same relevant characteristics, and two, having them in the same proportion that the target group does. So that's one of the main things that we're going to want to pay attention to. There's also this notion of selective attention, which basically just says that it's the tendency to focus intensely on particular things and to observe or to remember them, and then to ignore or suppress other things. The example that Vaughn gives us at the bottom of page 95 here says, well, we may tell our friends that the TV show Stranger Things is a lousy TV series because we remember three of the episodes that were really quite boring. And conveniently, we forget the other four episodes that we thought were actually quite superb. Right, so that's an example using a TV show. Another example from my own life using a TV show is recently my wife really wanted me to watch the show called Twin Peaks. It's an older show that came out, I think, in like the 80s or 90s. It's kind of a weird show, and it's actually a show that I'm quite enjoying right now. But the very first episode I did not like at all. The very first episode, there was no real storyline. I didn't understand what was happening, and every single character was crying because this one girl had been murdered, and so it seemed sort of outlandish and really ridiculous, and it was hard to follow. And so I didn't like it. I focused on the fact that that first episode was really quite terrible. At least, I mean, I still think the first episode was quite terrible. But it wasn't until I gave it a chance and I went through the whole series that I thought it was actually a pretty good, interesting show. So selective attention here is the example to focus on just that one episode, if you will. But of course, that would be biased. I shouldn't judge the whole TV show based upon one of the episodes, or even just one aspect of one of the episodes. Why is bias sampling so important? I think this comes up very importantly in opinion polls. So I want to talk a little bit about opinion polls. So there's going to be a couple other videos that I've included that I want you to pay attention to, where it'll dig into sort of the science of opinion polls in more detail. Basically, though, an opinion poll are an important example of very commonly used inductive reasoning. But keep in mind that these can be tricky, right? They should be both strong and they should have true premises. A good opinion poll should, in that sense, be cogent, right? It's not just likely, but we should have some guarantee that the premises, in fact, are true, which then makes the conclusion likely to be true. And this means that they should satisfy the following requirements. First, they must use a large enough sample that they accurately represent the target population and all of the population features. And then second, they must generate accurate data. That is, they must correctly reflect what they purport to say. Oftentimes, opinion polling, especially around politics and different elections, or to what extent is a politician doing well, these sorts of opinion polls can be very misleading, very biased, and highly problematic, especially when we're trying to do a good job of informing the public of some particular issue. So one thing that we need to make sure that we do with regard to opinion polls is we need to use random sampling. Random sampling is a method of selecting participants for some poll where every individual in the population has an equal chance of being chosen. And that's going to help ensure that the results will be fairly represented in the whole group, and avoid some sort of biased sampling. So this was actually much easier to do when we had landlines, when everybody had a landline telephone, because we could randomly select people to call, some group of people from a population, and that would ensure that it was less likely that we're going to have a biased sample. However, in today's society, this is not the case, and that's because the methods that we used previously for polling have changed. Most people don't have landlines now, and the people that do have landlines are likely going to be much older and probably white middle class individuals. And so what we are seeing in nowadays is a form of self-selecting sample. So this is a sample made up of individuals who actually voluntarily choose to participate in the poll. And this often leads to biased results because those with strong opinions are much more likely to participate and then respond to the poll. Right. So this is something that happens on online surveys when you're on a website and it asks you to take some poll or answer some questions. Maybe on a TV show where only the fans choose to fill out some particular survey, or where you can actually call into the poll during like a radio show or during a podcast, or in the comments for some podcast. A website poll asking visitors to vote on an issue, or perhaps some sort of a feedback form that only dissatisfied customers actually complete. So these are ways in which we can conduct polling, but it's self-selecting, meaning that it's up to the individual to seek out the information or seek out the questions in the polling, rather than it being a random sample. And that's problematic. We saw this really explicitly take place during the 2020 election, and then since then, in post 2020 elections as well. And this is because of the rise of cell phones, the decline in landlines, as well as social media having a major influence. Right. So since the 2020 presidential election, polling has faced these sorts of challenges. So when there's fewer landlines, this makes it harder to reach certain voters through traditional methods. Cell phones offer a kind of very broad reach. So we're able to, conduct polling from all sorts of different populations. However, there's a lot of legal issues that come into play with regard to things like auto dialing. And again, social media can spread bad polls very, very quickly. This happens all the time, where social media is actually amplifying these biases and unscientific polls. So these are the sorts of changes that are currently taking place that makes polling very difficult to conduct. It can still be done, but it's certainly facing a lot of challenges that affect how accurate these polls actually are with regard to representing public opinion. Now, one thing that is helpful, though, is this idea of a margin of error. Margin of error is the number that shows how much the poll results could differ from the true opinion of the whole population. So when you have a smaller margin of error, that means that you're going to have more confidence in the results. So, for instance, if you have plus or minus 3%, that typically means that you've got a good poll. So then that would generally suggest that the actual support of the public opinion could be either 3% higher or perhaps lower than it's actually reported. And so that's a good way of sort of hedging your bets to make sure that you're leaving room for error. There are other methods that people try to utilize. For instance, some polling organizations will actually take an average of a number of different polls. While that can be helpful, I still think that it's problematic because if most of those polls are biased in some sort of way, then finding the average of problematic polls is not really going to help. So there are certainly challenges, though different organizations are trying to combat these challenges, really trying to face them in order to get a better understanding of the public opinion at large. Again, I've included a few videos for you to watch that talk about the science of public opinion polls, especially as it relates to politics and so forth, and some of the challenges that we face post the 2020 election. So as you can see here, what we're going to turn to in the next video lecture will be another form of inductive reasoning called analogical induction. So that's what we'll do in the next video.